Today I've got Flamy Grant with me, which is probably the best drag name of all time. I mean, I don't know drag as well as like you do, or certainly a lot of other people do, but my guess it's one of the better drag names. I know usually drag names have some sort of pun, but this is one of the better puns I think out there. But anyway, how are you doing today?
I'm really good. Thanks so much for having me. And yeah, I think for a very specific subset of people, I definitely have the best drag name. I don't know that it
I'm sure.
applies across the board, but I think some people hear it and they're like, "Oh, that's the one."
When you get outside of that niche of people, are they like really confused by the name? Like what happens in those moments for you?
Oh yeah. So many times I have had to like pronounce it out loud before people get it because they'll see it and be like Flammy or like and oh my gosh, one time I did a show in LA for like I was definitely the oldest person in the room and it was just lovely Gen Z musicians hanging out with them and one of them came up to me and was like, "I don't get the reference." And I was just like, "Oh, I am so old." But, you know, it's all good.
Well, I mean, as long as it's like somebody who grew up in like Christian world in the
Mhm.
90s, then you're
Yeah.
golden.
Those are my
Which
people, honestly,
That's right.
like, those are my folks.
Love it, love it. Well, before we dive into like your own history, your faith, some of the exciting things that have happened recently for you, before we get into all of that, who is Flamy Grant to Flamy Grant?
Flamy Grant to Flamy Grant. You know, I feel like I'm still getting to know who she is. I've only been doing drag for 3.5 years, I guess over three and a
Okay.
half years now. Um, and when I started this thing, it was purely for my own entertainment. I had no intentions of making this a career or honestly even releasing a record under Flamey Grant's name or anything like that. It was I was curious and pandemic happened and I had all kinds of free time that I had never had in my life before. And so I spent it, in between episodes of Tiger King because we all
Yeah, I
watched
mean, we
Tiger
all were
King.
there. And
I
making
was watching
sourdough bread.
yeah, and the sourdough bread, absolutely. I was spending my free time watching like YouTube makeup tutorials and just binging Drag Race, and I've loved drag for a long time, and just was finally like, oh, let's paint my face in my bedroom, which I quickly felt like turned into inner child work for me. It was kind of reconnecting with the kid who like was just naturally inclined to play with my mom's clothes and her makeup and all that kind of stuff until it
Right.
got shamed out of me because hello evangelicalism. And uh so that's all it was for me initially, and it wasn't until like one I had one TikTok video that kind of like took off and went a little viral, and seeing the feedback from people when that happened like really shifted something for me. I've
Mm,
been a songwriter and a musician my whole life, but this kind of the way that Flamey somehow can like do something that Matthew can't, like connect with people on a level that I've never done. I've never been able to do that before. It just really opened my eyes to the power of drag and the possibility for it. And so I feel like in the past year I've really settled into like a little bit more of who Flamey is, but I'm still like
mhm.
finding every day new ways that she surprises me and surprises the people that I perform for and with and just create community with. And but I mean, my tagline is I'm a shame slaying, hip swaying, singing, songwriting drag queen, right? So that's where I've kind of honed it down to those things. Like the shame slaying piece is massive for me. That's I would say that is the reason I do drag more than anything else. Is
Mhm.
because for me it has been such a liberating experience and just helped me kind of sever those last ties that I had to shame, to the oppressive shame that I was raised in, to uh, believe that I had to fit in very specific boxes, believe I had to perform and behave and act in certain ways. And I don't think there's ever a useful um, purpose for shame.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so anytime I see it now and experience it, I just feel like I'm really I have a fine-tuned like shame meter, and the second I start to sense it, I'm like, no. And that's just all thanks to Flamey and the gifts that she's given me. So
I love that. Love that. Well, I want to talk about kind of your personal drag story in a little bit, but before that, I'm sure there's a lot of other story to who you are, and certainly, obviously, with a name like Flamy Grant, you grew up in the evangelical world, especially in the '90s, and so I want to hear a little bit more about your faith journey and how things have changed over all these years.
yes. So, let's see where to start. I did grow up in the Appalachian Mountains of Western North Carolina. My tradition is called Plymouth Brethren, my religious
Oh
tradition that
yeah.
I grew up in. You're familiar?
Yeah, I mean, I remember reading all the Brian McLaren books, and he talked about how he grew up in that tradition as well.
Wait, really? How do I
Yeah,
not know this about Brian McLaren?
I'm fairly certain that's what it is. I
Oh
know
my
some sort of brethren.
god. Well, yeah. So Brethren is like its own thing. We're like an even weirder,
I could
like
maybe
Plymouth
maybe I'm
Brethren is,
wrong. I'm
yeah,
fairly certain I've heard him talk about like some sort of brethren growing up
yeah.
in that tradition, and it very well could be Plymouth Brethren then. I don't know.
Could be, it could be. The thing is, growing up in it, I never called it Plymouth Brethren until I left it, because we didn't call it that growing up in it. We just called ourselves the Assemblies,
Hmm.
which again, not in no way related to Assemblies of God or anything like that, but just it was very intentional because the
Yeah,
whole
he on his website he says he was brought up in a small fundamentalist group called the Plymouth Brethren.
my mind
You
has been
and Brian
blown,
McLaren
and
glued at the hip,
I need to go
probably
reread some
cousins,
books now. We probably are. Oh my god, no wonder.
or he's
Okay.
probably your uncle or something.
um, yeah, wow, that's wild. So it was very the whole ethos was we don't take the name of anything other than Jesus. So like we wouldn't call ourselves that we didn't have a denomination name because we felt that would have been idolatry. Like you just meet in the name of Jesus. Um and so we looked down on Baptists and Lutherans. We're like, Luther, like you meet in the name of Luther. Ugh. So it was very like super self-righteous in that way. And so growing up, our whole service is basically, if you have a penis, you get to talk. Like that's how it works. So there's no paid staff or anything like that. We didn't have a pastor. It's just we all show up in a room around grape juice and bread, and for an hour, give or take, the men take turns standing up and calling out a hymn to sing, or saying a prayer, reading a
So it's
few.
almost like an unprogrammed Quaker service or
Yes,
meeting, except only men able
except only
to.
men.
Yeah,
Yep.
interesting.
It is exactly like that. And the other thing about it, like I already talked about the shame, but the shame piece really started for me there. And more often than not, what that service kind of devolves into is just this like weeping, gnashing of teeth kind of mode where, like, we had one gentleman in particular who every single Sunday of my life growing up started talking, and within 30 seconds was just like a blubbering mess and no one could understand him. And it was just like he just carried this, like, I'm such a wretched sinner shame with him at all times. And like that was his release, his weekly release, to like cry it out and thank God for saving such a horrible person as him and that kind of thing. And so it just felt heavy every
Mhm,
Sunday. It was never like church was not a celebration, even though we were kind of gathering around the communion table. And we, Lord's Supper, we called it Lord's Supper, and um, like celebrating the sacrifice and like all the whole substitutionary atonement, all of it.
mhm.
Um, it was never celebratory. It was always heavy and dark and oppressive. Um, and then we would break and have like donuts. So yeah, that's, I mean, what I grew up in, and that's what I was like being trained for as a person who was being trained to be male, raised male. I The expectation there for me in particular, I was the oldest of all my grandpa's grandchildren. And he was kind of we didn't have a pastor, but if we did, it would have been my papa. Like
Mm.
he was kind of the pillar of our community. um, the most motivated like member of this particular congregation, and led the music and did a lot of the preaching, that kind of thing. So I just felt like a really uh I just felt very obligated that, like, that this is my path. I'm gonna like follow papa's footsteps. I'm going to be, the next leader of this little tiny congregation in the mountains of Western North Carolina. Um, and it never felt right to me. I actually never, when you turn 12, like that's when you're supposed to get baptized, and I did. And then after that, Papa immediately started talking to me about, okay, Matthew, you're a man now, so it's time for you to speak up on Sunday mornings. Like, when are you going to do it? And I never did, like, not one
Mm,
time. And that's not because I'm not a very vocal person or like don't have leadership qualities or anything like that. I feel like I have all of that. It's just in that space, something about it didn't work for me. Um, and so I've still never to this day actually said a word um, during like that service. I did special
wow.
music as a musician, and I would perform and do things like that, but I never did, which is really weird as I think about it.
Yeah, that is interesting. So obviously you grew up in this like super patriarchal kind of Christian world, and it even like I would really argue is even a little bit more fundamentalist than just like kind of more mainstream evangelicals. And so how did you get into a world where you knew about like Christian music, certainly someone like Amy Grant and all of that? Because it sounds like this kind of this fundamentalist Christian world would even like think that Christian music like Amy Grant is like, especially Amy Grant, especially during that
Yeah.
time, would have been like very almost heretical even.
Yeah. Sometimes I wonder if it was the actual fact that we were so disconnected from culture that allowed me to listen to probably more than I would have been allowed to listen to if like people had
Mm,
known what was really going on. I don't I don't know how aware like my parents were about Amy Grant. I think I'm pretty sure they knew like the divorce happened and that kind of stuff, just because that was such a like moment in Christianity, and everybody was drawing lines around that. Um, so I don't know if it was the fact that we were so isolated from culture, or if there was actually maybe a little bit like a piece of the way we did things that allowed for like there was grace, maybe there was
mm,
actually some actual grace happening in our midst. And I do think that a lot of the people I grew up with really had the best intentions and really wanted to be loving people. Especially a lot of the women. We just had so many old women in our church, and I got my cheek pinched all the time. Like I was kind of the golden kid, like their favorite. And so I don't know. I can't really figure out why I was allowed to listen to Amy Grant. There was one Sunday where I got her House of Love record for Christmas on cassette, and we were on our way to church that week or that day, and I was like, "Put in my new Amy Grant," and "Lucky One" is the first song, and like you know. Eight bars in, my mom is like, "This isn't about Jesus," and like took it out and like handed it back to me. She's like, "We're on our way to church. We have to be listening to Christian music right now." So like the stigma was all still there, but yeah, I loved her.
oh, she's so great, and it reminds me of a story where so I was way more into, like, the hardcore alternative kind of Christian music stuff,
Yep,
and I still remember listening to Underoath for the first time, and I don't know if you know who Underoath is, but, like, they scream and everything, right?
yep.
And I remember listening, because I heard them on this, like, this Christian TV channel or whatever that was kind of like the Christian version of MTV, and looked them up on the computer, started listening to them on the computer, and my mom like overheard me listening to this screaming music, and she was very very concerned right away that it wasn't like Christian music. And so I was like, no, 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 it is Christian. And she had like never heard of Christian music that like screamed like this before. So she was so out of the loop. And I was like, look at the lyrics. And like, here they are on this like Jesus freak hideout page and all of this stuff. So anyway,
Oh
I
my
had to really
gosh, the
convince her
Jesus
that
Freak
no, it really is.
Hideout. Wow.
Is that a name you haven't heard in a while or have ever
Yeah,
heard?
have not heard in a while. No, definitely have heard, but yeah,
Oh yeah,
hadn't thought
that
about
was
that.
like that was my main page, my home page, back in the day when I was a kid. I was
I love
just
it.
perusing all the profiles on all the different artists
Mm.
when I was a kid. So, anyway, so at some point, obviously, your faith completely shifted, going from like this fundamentalist group in North Carolina to where you're at now in your faith. Can you talk a little bit about what that story is? I would imagine you coming out and all of that probably plays a big part into it.
It definitely did. So I went to college for a couple years at a small Presbyterian school in Bristol, Tennessee, King College, and that was kind of the first time I was exposed to. Not entirely, actually. I was at a Christian school as well in Asheville. My mom was a teacher there, and some my K through 12 education was a Christian school, but still very conservative, fundamentalist
Hmm.
Christian school. That did have like multiple kids who were in multiple denominations attending the same school. So like my best friend was Presbyterian in high school, and so I had some like exposure to at least like the Christian world is like a little more broad than just us. Although I remember specifically one time in Sunday school, my papa saying Baptists weren't real Christians. So, there was just that. Um, but especially in college was where I really like, I mean, so many of us experience that for the first time in college, I think, where you're like, oh, like there are people who there are Christians who just believe like wildly different things than I do. I like my best one of my best friends from college still to this day. I remember we almost weren't friends because the first time I met her, she was like, "Yeah, evolution, like so cool how that happened, right?" And I was like, "Excuse me, what was that?" Um, so yeah, just it started there and it just continued. I mean, I stayed in conservative Christianity for a long time. I moved to Reno, where I got my first job in a church as a worship leader on a church staff, and it was a mega church, kind of non-denominational, generic, whatever, uh, but still very conservative. And then from there, I was part of a church plant team that moved down here to San Diego, which is where I live until literally this Thursday. I'm moving to North Carolina, but I planted a church down here in San Diego that was more part of like that whole emerging church
Yeah,
movement.
the world that I was in for quite some time too.
Yeah, I just threw up in my mouth a little bit saying that, but uh, so like just this very gradual, like my eyes kind of opening up to the fact that maybe we didn't have it all figured out in the Plymouth Brethren Assembly back in Appalachia. Maybe are a lot of perspectives. Um, Me being queer also played a huge role in all of that from really from the earliest t- uh, times. I've always kind of had that, I guess, a rebellious streak, but more just like an inquisitive, curious like streak that is not. I don't like just accepting at face value what is handed to me. I want to understand why we believe certain things or where beliefs come from and those sorts of things. So I've always asked harder questions that would routinely get brushed aside or be like, "Oh, God works in mysterious ways,"
Hmm.
that those kinds of responses. So I've just always kind of had a little bit of that critical like eye towards my faith, and especially um, being queer. I mean, that was for me. It was about 2007 was my big like turning point where I was like, someone's lying. Like, I enrolled myself in conversion therapy. I did that for 5 years. I, I was just very committed for a long time to being single and celibate, even though I was like, I'm like, well, I'm gay and I can't change that, but I guess I'll be single and celibate because that's the thorn in my side, and I just have to do
Hmm.
that, right? Um, so I a lot of very sincere practice on my end to try and make things work, to try and belong and fit in the world that I occupied. Um, and then when I finally reckoned with my sexuality, with my identity, and with what the Bible really says about all of that stuff, that was when I kind of pivoted and was like, if I'm gonna do Christianity anymore, it has to look dramatically different for
Mm.
me. And I didn't for a while. I went full apostate for a minute. I had a podcast called Heathen that I did for 5 seasons, and where we just talked about. It was before like deconstruction was a buzzword, so
Right.
I didn't know that there was a whole community of people doing that. I was just like, I'm just a heathen. I'm an apostate. So I want to talk about that with other people. Um, But yeah, kind of swung back around in more recent years to occupy the space I'm in now, which is like Christian adjacent. I
What would
guess
you
I'm a
say has brought you to that? Like, what is it about Christianity that is bringing you back to, like, "At least I want to be Christian adjacent,"
yeah.
and
I
also
mean,
top the music charts, the Christian music charts?
part of it's cultural, like purely just cultural. Like it's what I know, it's the language I speak. Some of that, the old time hymns, the old time religion, like it gets in your bones and it doesn't actually ever leave. So, but I would say the biggest reason, I mean, at the end of the day, I'm a universalist now. Like that's just like it's just everybody's in, baby, it all belongs. Like that's where I
Mhm,
land. But the reason I kind of stick around in Christian space is pretty much exclusively because I was a queer kid who grew up in that space and had no idea that there was a future for me that could be where I could thrive, where I could feel joy, where I could have a partner, where like none of that was an option. That I was prevented from seeing that at every turn, and so um, I've just been inspired by a lot of other queer people who are taking up space in the church
mm,
and making sure that we're visible, making sure that we're seen, so that that next generation has something to has a way to imagine a future for themselves that doesn't
mm,
involve like despair and lying dead in a gutter with a needle in their arm, because that's honestly what I thought would happen to me if I ever left
right,
the church.
right.
So
And I think Christianity has so much more to offer than like that scenario happening, right? There's
yeah.
so much more to Christianity, and I'm certainly pretty convinced at this point that Jesus does not want that scenario to happen either. That there's so many different kind of ways that Jesus would love to see the way of the way that he thought of the world to happen than a
Mm,
kid in the gutter who just can't make it anymore. So
yeah.
I think there's so much more that Christianity has to offer, and I certainly believe that Jesus has so much more to offer the world than that.
Mm. I love that. I love that. I mean, I think I would probably agree. I think I'm maybe just a little more hesitant because I've just been burned by so many people
Totally.
who yeah, and who even say that me as a queer person, me saying that like is not a valid, like it doesn't mean anything coming from a queer person, right? Like because I'm just
Mm,
immediately disqualified because of my queerness. But
right.
I love that there's a place for hope still
Oh,
in
yeah, absolutely.
Christianity and what the faith can offer people.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, you talked a little bit about your kind of personal drag story of around the pandemic, start of the pandemic is kind of when you started doing, like, makeup tutorial stuff, or at least, like, watching makeup tutorials, and then eventually gets you to this point of starting to do drag. Can you talk a little bit about kind of from wherever that point you left off earlier, to where you're at now when it comes to drag? Like, talk about that part of the story.
Yeah, sure. So it really was pandemic. I had gone out in drag a couple times prior to pandemic for Halloween. Like 2019 was my first time ever in drag because it's an easy, safe place to do drag,
Mhm.
right? And then I went to a couple house parties in drag, but it just like I said, I didn't have time for it. I was a very busy person,
Well, I
and
I do wanna talk about this later, but it does seem as if drag has gotta be one of the most time-consuming things because I already, like, know how much time it takes just to see somebody do simple makeup, but there's a lot of makeup that goes on in drag, and it has got to take hours upon hours, and if you're doing this, like, very frequently, it's gotta be, like, a significant time, just a it just takes up a lot of time for people.
it takes up so much. Drag is exhausting. It is so exhausting, and that is like the first thing I tell anybody now who's like, "Oh, I'm interested. I want to get into drag." I'm like, "Okay, well, get ready because you've got to either spend a shit ton of money buying costumes from people who know what they're doing or learn to make them yourself. You got to stone, rhinestone everything you own. You've got to learn to do your makeup really well. You've got to learn to style a wig. What's your act going to be? Like, who's your drag persona? Are you just going to be, are you going to purely lip sync? And if so, like, what's your style? Are you going to dance? Can you dance? Do you need to learn how to dance? If you can sing, like, are you going to sing? Like, just, are you a comedy queen? There's so much that goes into it, which is initially what kind of drew me to it. I'm that person who like gets super excited about like 18 things and then does them, halfway. Does half of them
Mm.
halfway. Because there's just, there's no time in the world to do everything that you want to do. So yeah, I think making drag my full-time thing, like I've been working towards this for a while. It really just 2 weeks ago I finally quit my day job, and now I am officially for the first time a
Wow,
full-time
congrats.
drag artist. Thank you. But yeah, I've been working to get here for a while, and it is very time consuming. And if it hadn't been for the pandemic, not that I you know, no snaps for Miss Rona, but if it hadn't been for that opportunity that it provided me to sit alone and shelter in place in my house for a year and a half, like I don't know that I ever would have made it. I never would have gotten into it to the degree I have. So, like I said, it started as inner child work for me. Like it was let's just go have fun, make up playtime in my bedroom. To uh, during the pandemic, I shared a house with two other art. My husband and I shared a house with another couple who were both musicians. So we started doing a live stream like every artist did during pandemic. Every Thursday night, we'd be singing cover songs to like 30 people on Facebook, and I started showing up to those in drag. And that was my first time ever performing, quote unquote, in drag. Was just for mostly friends and a few people we picked up along the way every week. And um, I already mention the TikTok thing going
Well, you
viral and
mentioned
how
that
that.
there was one TikTok in particular that kind of
Yeah.
blew up a little bit.
Yeah, so that and then that was when that was still pretty early on, maybe I can't remember exactly when that happened, but m halfway through the sheltering in place portion of pandemic, that happened, and I started to think, "Oh, like, there is something here.
Mhm,
There's a piece to this art form that can, yeah, connect with people in ways I've never been able to." So,
mhm.
I think that's actually it probably happened shortly before Wild Goose, actually, because
Oh.
yeah, we got booked for Wild Goose to do basically what we were doing on our live stream. Which was to bring we called it Heathen Happy Hour because we basically pivoted the podcast and turned it into that live stream. So we brought Heathen Happy Hour to Wild Goose, and then we ended up getting bumped to the main stage because somebody else canceled. We weren't supposed to be on the main stage at Wild Goose because we were nobody. Like we were a live stream playing for 30 people, but they needed to fill a spot, and my bandmate knew somebody and whatever. So we ended up on the main stage there, and I don't know, it just things started rolling after that. It was
Mm,
like, um, I think people seeing drag in a Christian context, in a spiritual context, which at the time it was all new for me too. Like I got asked to give the sermon in drag at our virtually at our church during pandemic, and I was like, I have no idea what that looks like. I like I can't even. I've never seen that. I can't imagine it. So um, that TikTok video that went viral was actually my attempt at it was a practice. I was like, how do I give a sermon if I'm a drag queen?
mm,
Um, and so it took off. Uh, so it's just been this slow, like my kind of my eyes have slowly been opened wider and wider to the possibility for this art form and what it can do, and how in so many ways, actually, I've kind of been laying the groundwork without knowing it for years, like
mm,
years and years, like just being a songwriter since I was like 9 years old when I wrote my first song, being a worship leader, like learning how to hold space for people and create, you know, communal moments, that kind of thing. And then, just like loving comedy, loving stand up, loving all the other elements that I bring to my drag, like was like, "Oh, this is the art form for me finally." Like
mm,
there's a reason like just me being a singer-songwriter all those years never really went anywhere. It's because I needed this voice. I needed this perspective. Flamey's voice to be able to write from and sing from and speak to people from. So, um I like even with what's happened in the past month, I still feel like I'm realizing the extent to which uh drag communicates to folks.
mm.
I never expected that there would be I never expected that I would get to have a freaking like one of the worship songs I wrote for my old church would be sung in other churches around the country now. Like that's still like that's a mind-blowing thing to me.
Mhm.
So, I don't
All it
know.
took was you to just be a drag queen.
I guess, yeah, and a certain a conservative worship leader to take notice, but
Well, that
yes.
that that doesn't That helps a little bit. Uh, without, like, getting too much into the weeds of all of this, I'm really just curious about the history of drag, and certainly I wouldn't imagine that you're, like, probably some, like, scholar of drag history or anything, but I would imagine you've, like, done a little bit of research into, like, understanding, like, how we have gotten to the point where we have when it comes to drag performances. So can you talk just really briefly about the history of drag?
Yeah, I mean, again, I will echo what you said. I'm certainly not a scholar, and I don't have all the backstory and the details, but I have done. I've looked into it as a drag queen. I'm like, yeah, where did this come from? And I mean, we obviously had Shakespeare, like drag was happening on Shakespearean stages, like back in his day, um, but closer to what we have now. I think really there's a queen by the name of William Dorsey Swan, was a black man, who was his credited as being like the first kind of modern drag queen. At I wish I knew the dates. I could probably pull them up real quickly, but I mean, I think well over 100 years ago,
Wow.
in America. Yeah, and like performing in like secret places, right? Like in people's homes, that kind of thing. Like queer people coming together to enjoy drag, and I think the reason so much of it, um, and people kind of still have this notion that like drag is a seedy thing that happens in dark rooms, right? Is because it did have to happen in secret places, like queer people have always had to kind of find each other surreptitiously because we didn't have grinders and we didn't have gay bars. We didn't have it. We weren't allowed. It was not allowed.
Mhm.
So we had to find each other secretly, and then we had to gather and congregate secretly. And so, yeah, drag is very much a queer art form. It's like a product of queer culture. It is. Um, I just call it at the kind of the bottom line thing that ties all drag together is that it's gender fuckery of some sort. Like we are, it's a way to challenge, and address and acknowledge that the binary, um, male female, the gender binary that we have socially constructed in our world today, and very much so in America in particular, doesn't work. It doesn't work for everybody, and um, so drag's kind of a big fu to that binary, and it's also just like a play space, and kind of
Mhm.
like similar to how I came to find it, where it was this like let me reparent the little kid who got in trouble for like putting on my mom's lipstick. Um, it's a space where we let our imaginations run free, where we do that work with our inner child, where we just get happy and celebratory, and like queer
Mhm.
joy comes from those spaces. So I mean, obviously the way drag has, become this mainstream phenomenon now is thanks to RuPaul and all of the groundwork she laid, and starting her show RuPaul's Drag Race. Like that's the thing that has put the spotlight on drag, and put the target on drag as well, I
Mhm.
think. um but so we would be nowhere without, like drag would still probably not be a lucrative career option if it had not been for her and the work she's done. um
Absolutely.
yeah,
You mentioned a bit ago that, like, drag at the end of the day is gender fuckery, and I really like the way you described that. And I think what's, interesting about drag is even, like, after, like, I would have said I was, like, LGBTQ affirming and all of that, I still didn't really quite understand drag, like, it didn't really make much sense to
sure.
me, and I thought for a lot like, I think a lot of it was and I would imagine a lot of other people have thought about this too, regardless of, like, where they stand on LGBTQ, rights and everything, is that a lot of people might assume that, like, drag is for people who are experiencing some sort of gender dysphoria or something
Mm,
like that, and what I've realized is that may or may not be the case, I don't know exactly, but what certainly seems to be the case is that this is just about, like, fucking up gender norms and gender roles and
yes,
all of that. So
yes,
it really is less about someone experiencing gender dysphoria, and it's more about just simply fucking with gender.
yes, yeah, totally. And like you said, it absolutely, like there are so many trans artists who do drag. Like that can be part of like the trans experience. It can be, and trans can be part of the drag experience too. Like there are people who like start doing drag and then realize, oh, I'm like my gender is different than what's on my birth certificate. And um but then at the same time, yes, it's like for me, I mean, I definitely drag definitely kind of I identify as non-binary now, and I do that pretty much as a result of having done drag and felt what it's like to live in the world without the restrictions that feel implicit to owning a certain set of genitalia, right? Like
Mhm.
and it's the fuckery part of it that has enabled me to be like fuckery with performance that has now enabled me to be like I like I'm gonna stop performing in general. Like I'm going like I'm not gonna walk around the world and try to speak, look, behave in the ways that people expect me to based on what they see when they look at me. Like, and it's such a freeing, phenomenal experience for me because my God, I just, like, the number of times I just desperately would try to fit in, especially in Christian culture, especially in evangelical
Mhm.
culture, with like the men, right? Like to go to the men's groups and like promise keepers and like let's go paintballing. We have a men's church paintball event, those kinds of things that I hated. I hated every minute of paintball with other men, and yet I did it over and over again because I don't I had to. Like I felt like I had to. That was the expectation. And so that's the gift I feel like of drag is that it can help people dismantle um these made up norms that we have about how to behave and who to be in the world. And
Mhm.
I some of the people who are the most impacted and oppressed by patriarchy, I think, are cis straight men, right? Like
Mhm.
and I've seen it, and I know so many friends who've like been through that experience where they are like, oh my God, like watching you do what you do in drag like just makes me realize that I'm like I don't like patriarchy either. What's the
Mhm.
line in the Barbie movie? Once I realized patriarchy wasn't about horses, I kind of lost interest. Like that's I think that's the gift of drag is it can just be like, why are you doing that, babe? Like think about it
Mhm.
for a second. Why are you behaving the way you behave? Is it because you got bros to impress? And do
Mhm.
you really want to be spending your energy doing that? Is that really the best thing for you?
Mhm.
And sometimes it is. Like I'm not saying that like some of the gender stuff isn't a norm for a reason. Like there may be inclinations for people based on sex, but the gender part of it is what we can definitely fuck up. And
Yeah,
I love drag for that reason.
I love it. So something recently very, very interesting happened to you, and it's one of the cooler kind of Christian stories that I think that's happened this year. And so, can you talk a little bit about going number one in the Christian music charts? I think this is just a fascinating story.
Yes. It's so wild. So I a year ago, almost a year ago now, released my first record as Flamy Grant. It's called Bible Belt Baby, and I wrestled with where to place this record for a while. Um, you know who Semler is. I'm sure a lot of your audience knows who Semler is.
Hmm.
If you don't, Semler's kind of the first out queer artist to to do that, to go number one on the iTunes Christian charts. Um, we became TikTok buds over during pandemic, and Semler actually guested on my record on an Amy Grant cover, nonetheless.
Mm.
And so I've just been super inspired watching Semler do what they do and reach the audience that they've reached as a Christian artist, like releasing their music in that Christian genre. I wasn't convinced it was for me initially. I was intrigued, and I was like, and especially when I finished the record and like looked at it as a whole, I was like, this feels like the Christian music I was listening to in the 90s, that was very confessional, very about my spiritual journey, very singer-songwritery. It's not like the worship crap that I'm sorry, but I hate worship music so much. Like, we
Hmm.
sing it in church every Sunday. Why do we have to, like, also have radio stations that play it all week? Um, I like storytelling. Like, that's what I'm here for, and those are the artists that I'm attracted to. So when I looked at my record, I was like, this feels like that to me. It feels like a like if Bebo Norman were queer. Like that's what that's what this is. And I mean, not that whatever. I'm not trying to say my qualities is good or whatever, but like that's the vein I was in. And so that coupled with what I've already talked about and wanting to take up space in Christianity so that the next generation of queer kids have somebody to see. Those are the two things really that made me decide to release the record as a Christian record. So I did, and there was like a little bit of a stir, not much. I was a very independent artist. Like I did not have any kind of marketing machine behind me or anything like that. So I was very pleased with how the record did. Like
Mhm.
it certainly was my most listened to album I'd ever released in my life, and I was really happy with it. And I've been able to play shows and get booked on it and that kind of thing. So I've been very very pleased. Um, 10 months after the record was released, I played a show with Derek Webb in Nashville. Derek is a former lead singer of the band Caedmon's Call, which is another massive selling band, Christian band from like the late '90s, early 2000s. And Derek and I
And
have
one
become
of, like, you mentioned you really love that kind of more confessional 90s
oh
Christian
yeah.
music, and, like, to me, Caedmon's Call feels like the, like, epitome of that confessional singer-songwriter, kind of Christian music.
Yes, heroes to me, Aaron Tate and Derek, like just the songwriters I wanted to be. Um, so very, very cool that I have gotten to become friends with Derek over the years. He actually did my podcast back in I think 2018, and that was where we kind of first met face to face, and just hit it off and became friends after that. So Derek was on my record on the song "Good Day," and then Derek just released a record this year as well called the Jesus Hypothesis, and
So good.
in so good, so good. He invited me to be a featured artist on a song on that record. So we made a music video where I put Derek in drag. And probably most of your audience is aware of this stuff, but um, so all that to say, like, there's this relationship with Derek. He brought me out to Nashville to open for him at his album release show, and a picture got taken of me and Jennifer Knapp and Tiffany Arbuckle of Plum and Derek. And so, like, when I posted it, I was like, one of these is not a '90s Christian rock star like the others. Um, but that photo made its way to Sean Foyt, who, if you don't know, I'm very jealous of you. But if you do know, he's a conservative worship leader whose like big moment in the spotlight happened during pandemic when he was holding these massive like worship services at the height of pandemic with a bunch of unmasked people out in public, and we all got really mad about it, right? So, and that's really literally all I knew about Sean before this happened. But he retweeted the photo and said, what did he say? This is the end goal of the deconstruction movement. Christian artists, meaning Derek, collaborating with a drag queen, which I thought was kind of funny because I was in this scenario. I'm actually the Christian artist, and Derek is no longer. But whatever. Um, uh, so I'm, part of being a drag queen in 2023 is you just have trolls on your page all the time, and I'm just used to
Mhm.
it, and I kind of get a kick out of responding to them sometimes. So I just was like, end goal, baby, no, 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 we're just getting started. To which Sean replied, well, good thing for us, no one, hardly anyone listens to you or cares what you do. And that is when I was like, oh, this is an opportunity.
Yes.
So, that's the other thing that I think every drag performer has in common, like the gender fuckery component, and then the ability to like recognize an opportunity to like work something for our benefit, right? Like because drag it's a subversive thing and it's a grassroots thing, and just like we all have that mentality. So I was like, okay, well, let me go to my followers on TikTok and say, this guy is saying that no one cares about a drag queen who's occupying space in Christianity or releasing worship music or whatever. So I've got this song, Good Day. I released it 10 months ago. Do you think there's a chance we could get this song to chart on iTunes Christian charts and for the first time in history, have a drag artist on the Christian charts. And because I had seen Semler do it, and because I had that thankfully that trail had been blazed. Again, that's kind of like I never would have thought to do this if it hadn't been for Semler. I never
Mhm.
would have like had that vision for a future that could look like that. So props to Semler. Thank you for doing that work for all of us. And I don't know. I posted the video. I woke up the next morning, and my song was already number 6. And then by the end of the day, it had hit number 1, and the album also hit number 1 and stayed there for 9 days, which was wild to be like the literal face of Christian music. When you open iTunes, was my like painted
Yeah, your
face.
drag outfit. Yeah. It's unbelievable. I mean, just like such a cool story. And then after all that happened, your boy Sean decided, you know what? I don't like being proved wrong, and block. Which might not be able to keep doing that very much longer. You might be able to troll him even more
I
if
know,
Elon gets
right?
his way.
Yeah, he's blocked a lot of people over this, from what I understand. A lot of people who follow me now are like, "Oh yeah, I just got blocked too because I mentioned you to him." So I think we got under his skin a little bit.
I think he's got a little bit of a thorn in his side.
Yes.
I love it. Well, I think it's one of the coolest moments that has happened over the last couple years in Christian music, and certainly you and Semler being probably some of the top two. I mean, it's just what a really cool moment, and yeah, here we are. And then you got all the like media attention from it.
Yeah.
In fact, I've got like the NBC or sorry, the Today Show article about it. I know like Billboard did a thing. I think
Mhm.
Today did a thing, and so anyway, it was just super cool to see a lot of people like, oh wait, this is a really cool moment
Yeah.
in Christian history, and we can all owe it to Sean Foyt. Thanks,
Yes,
Sean.
yes, we can. Yeah, I think it is. And actually, one of the reporters who interviewed me like said this explicitly. He's like, "This is kind of a microcosm of the country and like what's going on right now in this national dialogue where evangelical, really conservative people are coming for drag and are scapegoating drag and making drag like the thing that we're going to get really mad about right now. And yet here is a drag queen who is a product of that world and who has decided to not vacate it, and instead to like make something within that the context of that world. Like it's kind of a it's I don't know. It's just like I think that's why the story took off and why it's interesting to people is because we already
Hmm.
had this kind of national discussion happening.
Hmm. Well, with all of the things that have happened over the last few years with you doing drag, and again, like being a person of faith, somebody whose faith has clearly changed throughout your life, where would you say like you see drag shaping and forming your faith now? Like how have you seen drag shape your theology, shape your faith, shape the way you think about God, whatever? How has drag actually been a direct influence of shaping that?
Mm. Well, I think one thing to just point out that's super cool is that like I said, when I first was asked to give that sermon in drag, I had no context for that. I was like spirituality and drag, like those weren't things that I thought went together.
Hmm.
But what's happened for me in the aftermath of that is being introduced to a whole host of drag artists who do exactly that, who like bring a spiritual element to their drag and actually find their drag to be a spiritual practice, right? Which I think is so cool and kind of what I was doing without realizing it, talking about the inner child work piece. Um, so I gosh, the things drag has taught me. I mean, starting first and foremost with that, like that ability to reparent ourselves, to love ourselves, um, uh, to love past versions of ourselves, and the whole like just transcending and including, like like taking your
Hmm.
experience that might have been really hard and full of trauma, and not rewriting it, because obviously we've been through what we've been through, but no longer maybe no longer regretting large parts of it. I think that's been a thing for me is um, letting go of regret because it doesn't serve me in any way. Um, and instead being able to just kind of like take your story and your experience as a whole and be like, yeah, like there were really shitty times during that, young Matthew.
Mhm.
um, but you weren't any less loved. You weren't any less worthy, even though that's what you were being implicitly, sometimes explicitly taught and told. Um, and now we can embrace like all those pieces of you, um, in this moment, where we are now as an adult. And so that's been a huge part of what drag has done for me spiritually. Just like the, I mean, drag's an art form at the end of the day. So in the same way that any piece of art can take you to a transcendent place, beautiful sculpture, beautiful painting, beautiful music, beautiful drag can do that too, I think. Comedic drag can do that in really fun, subversive ways where
Mhm.
like it gets you laughing and then like kind of hits you with a hard truth or a powerful truth, in the middle of a joke. Like, um, I just think there's so much opportunity, um, to to just, if you can just appreciate drag as an art form, it can do anything that any other art form can do, right?
Mhm.
Um, it's such a, especially with the song "Good Day" and what's happened with "Good Day." I wrote that before. I wrote "Good Day" before I was a drag queen. Like Flamey didn't exist when I wrote that song. I actually wrote that for my last church, which was a very really progressive community. Um, but putting that song, those lyrics in the voice of a drag queen, being able to say, um, "I'm not content to fade into the crowd and let you decide who's in or out." Like to say that as a drag queen, like it just carries a different weight, a different message. Like I'm not gonna fade. I'm actually going to like be as bold. I'm gonna be as visibly queer as possible. I'm gonna be all the things, and I'm gonna plant my stiletto and stay in this, you know, hallowed ground. Um, I just think there's like power, uh, that transcends like, there's so many people in my DMs and my comments right now are not queer, right? Like it's,
Mhm.
and that's not my audience. Like I don't really write for straight people. Sorry, I love my straight allies, but like that's not, I'm not doing that work for that audience. I do that work for queer folks and the people who, are going through what I went through. But as it turns out, we're all human beings, right? And we all have like similar experiences of people silencing us or, oppressing us for whatever reason. And so
Mhm.
that art can connect with a broad audience, of people, and I love that. Like that's magic
Mhm.
to me.
Mhm. Absolutely. When I would imagine being a person who grew up in the Brethren tradition that you know your Bible well. When you think back or read back to the Bible now, are there any moments or stories where you're like, that feels really similar to like being a person in drag, or that's just similar to what drag queens experience, or like that's a drag story or something? But do you ever read back to the Bible and see some of those stories now?
I mean, Esther was my favorite story growing up. Like
Mm.
I think I already mentioned that. Like that was the story I would read in church, because church was boring. So like just that whole, yes, Esther's whole narrative I feel is just so very like being, um out of place in the culture that you're in, right? Like she became queen of Persia, and like that was not on her bingo card, as a poor Jewish girl. Um, so uh, and she became a literal queen. So I guess that's the other drag artist. We all want to be a queen too, but yeah, like there's, I think, being able to like look at the Bible in general through a lens that's different, like from the standard American white male like preaching that most of us got on it. Like I love hearing queer folks talk about Joseph and
Mm.
how Joseph was probably a queer person. Talk about David and Jonathan, right? Like, actually you just had a really good tweet, right? Tweet, where you pointed out, uh a
Yeah, I
verse.
mean, I always like make David and Jonathan jokes. I don't know what exact one it was, but
Yeah.
I love making those jokes. Mostly because I don't know if it's necessarily like that they were actually queer, but what I do love about it is the fact that it just absolutely pisses
It
conservatives
does,
off.
because it's been straight washed, right? That whole story has
Totally.
been straight washed, and, I mean, there is a very whether or not they were queer, there are queer elements to their relationship, like,
Hmm.
the way the Bible talks about them, like, I can't remember the verses,
Yeah,
but
and usually,
they're
like, when I make jokes about David and Jonathan, usually I'll get, like, the conservative trolls that are usually like, y we don't need, like, a queer reading of
mm,
whatever. Like, we don't need to read queerness into this story about, like, male intimacy, and my response always to that is, I don't need homophobes trying to lecture me about male intimacy and
mm,
the need for male intimacy in the world. I don't think that's really necessarily the homophobe's job to do that.
yeah, thank you. So yeah, I mean, for me, that like, especially with the song Esther, Ruth, and Rahab on the record, like that was where I just really needed to sit down and wrestle a little bit with how I was brought up, how I was taught to read the Bible, the stories that were given to me in Sunday school and from the pulpit every Sunday and that kind of thing. Like I I, I was like, my heroes were the women of the Bible. Like I'm sorry, there's no better hero in the Bible than Jael. Like, come
Mm,
on. That tent peg to the temple, like while like putting the guy to sleep, probably seducing him, like that's probably what happened. Like that's such an epic story. And those are the ones that stuck with me and resonated with me. And realizing that I was probably drawn to that to stories about women because that's just what like gay boys do. Like we love divas, right? Like
mhm.
even without growing up in like queer culture where like everybody just like gravitates like you pick your diva as a gay kid. I still was doing that just like instinctually, and that's why I think I was drawn to Amy Grant and then drawn to the stories of women in the Bible. But I wrote that song in particular because I was like, my sister had such a dramatically different experience growing up in the exact same culture I did because I was
Mm,
being raised to like lead the thing, and she was being raised to be quiet, be submissive, like just suppress every instinct she has, which is like she is this like exuberant, like intelligent, thoughtful, vocal human who did not get to lean into any of those gifts
mm.
growing up, and then I was like expected to, and couldn't, and so I wanted to like write not only a feminist anthem, but just like a song that showed how I think that's the thing. Like people sometimes tell me like, oh, like Esther, Ruth, and Rahab makes me feel so empowered, and I'm like, I'm not, I can't give you that power. That's not what I'm doing with that song. Like I think it's just showing that the women have always had that
Mm,
power, and whether or not they've been permitted to do it to like um, express that power visibly, like or not, I think they women find a way, right? Like the
mhm,
women in my church are the ones who raised me. They're the ones who made the impression, and then same thing with the Bible. It's the women in the Bible who somehow managed to like worm their way out of all the stories of the men and stick with me. So
mhm.
I don't know. I don't remember what question I'm answering when I'm talking about that now, but
Well, just the some of the Bible stories that resonate with you as a drag
ah,
queen, and, I
oh
even, like,
right,
think
yeah.
about the story of the incarnation, of God becoming
Mm,
a person in the person of Jesus. And I think about that story as a very kind of queer or even kind of drag reading of it, of
mm,
like God putting on a different outfit by becoming a human. And I think there's just something really powerful in that story. And so that was just one story. And I'm not like obviously a drag queen, so I have no idea what that experience is like. But I would imagine like maybe that's one that could be kind of a drag
yeah.
reading of it. But I was
You
curious
could
if there were
be.
any others too.
You could be Mason. We could do that. We could
Maybe
put you
one
in
day,
drag.
maybe.
Yeah, maybe one
We'll
day.
see. We'll see.
um, yeah, I think that it's important to recognize that the God of the scripture and of the New Testament too, Jesus, like actually had moments of change, right? Like
Mhm.
Jesus had his mind changed by the Canaanite woman. Initially, he was like, "No, I'm not here for you," and she changed his mind.
Mhm.
God in Isaiah says, "I'm doing a new thing." Like, just says it out loud. And those aren't the verses that get quoted back to me, unfortunately, on social media. Like, I get the millstone verse all the time. Um, so I love that we can like acknowledge that the deity that we are worshiping, gathering in the name of, building a whole religion around, like, changes. And that's
Ooh, we're getting now into process theology. You're right
yeah.
in my wheelhouse now.
Well, good. Then I'm gonna turn that over to you because that's about as that's as deep as I go there. But yeah,
Well,
we can
you
change ourselves with drag. God can change. Yeah, I love it.
that's right. Absolutely. You mentioned a little bit ago about some of the things that are going on in like kind of the conservative world around like putting a target on drag queens' backs. And I'm I don't wanna necessarily go into all of, like, what the rhetoric is and all of that, but there clearly, because of it, have been a lot of misconceptions and even outright lies that people believe about drag queens because of the targeting that they've been receiving. Can you talk about what some of those misconceptions and lies are and the ones that need to be corrected?
Yeah. Well, the thing I get called all the time, and I mean, not just drag queens now, but queer people in general, and straight allies now get called groomer all the time, right? And it's in the context of this sexual grooming. Like
Mhm.
that's that's the what's being projected onto us is that we are trying to turn kids either gay or I don't know, turn them into drag queens. I don't or get them to want to question their gender identity. Like there's this idea that's the gay agenda. And I think that so much of that is projection. That's a mirror because
Mhm.
if we want to get into indoctrination, I have a lot to say about that. If we want to talk about grooming, I have a lot to say about that. I was very much groomed from the earliest of ages to be something that I am not. And um so the correction there is not that we're out here with some agenda to like turn more people gay or like grow our ranks unnaturally, if you will. But it's like drag queens in particular, like the ones that choose to do drag story hour and those kinds of things, like where we're reading books to kids. Like that's not that is a act of volunteerism. Like that is those drag queens are not getting paid big money for that. Um, and they're not out there like I don't know. I don't know what the like conservative like what they're picturing is happening at those, but we're reading stories to kids in a costume, much like a Cinderella princess would at like a birthday party, that kind of thing. It's just storytelling in a costume, and it's if there is an intention or a quote unquote agenda behind it, it's just to show the breadth of the beautiful spectrum of humanity, right? Like
Mhm.
um there are fabulous kids books about you know same-sex parents like kids who have same-sex parents, that kind of thing. Like those stories do get read at those events, and that's because that's real life. Like that's because some of those kids have two parents of the same gender. Like it's not a indoctrination, it's not a grooming, um it's just talking about what already exists in the world.
Mhm.
Like that's all that is, and making sure that those kids know that that's a normal experience and that they're loved in it, right? Like that's all that is. So, yeah, the I don't even know what else to say about that. It's just such an absurd scapegoating, like very to me very transparent like projection from a community that unfortunately does have a lot of groomers, and not just like in the indoctrination side of that, but the actual sexual groomers.
Right.
Like that's happening in churches. That's not happening at drag story hours in libraries.
Mhm. I mean,
So,
the Southern Baptist Convention is literally under federal investigation for it, so
yes. Yes.
yeah, exactly. Well, with all of that happening in the world right now, what are ways that people can support drag queens with this target being placed on their back? What are ways that people can support folks who are doing drag other than listening to Good Day?
Definitely listen to Good Day, but uh, like if you have never been to a local drag show like in your town, like there is a local drag show in your town. I don't care how small your town is, all right? Like even if it's just like Junior down the street is like dressing up in their bedroom and maybe singing to their mom. Like there's drag happening around you and you should go experience it. And maybe you won't like it, maybe it's not for you and that's totally fine. Like there's lots of art forms. I don't like the screamo Christian stuff. I'm sorry, Mason. I just don't. I never got into it. It's not for me. But go experience it at least one time and see what kind of community is happening in that space. My guess is that you're going to be pretty damn surprised and you're actually going to maybe feel a little bit like you do when you go to church, like a good church service. Um, it's not there's not that much there's not too much space between I think like the good community that can happen in like you know good church and then what's happening at drag shows. Like it's just us coming together to be seen, to feel loved, and to celebrate all of the fabulousness that we can contain as human beings. And so go and take $1 bills. That's if you don't know, you need to take a stack of ones and you tip the girls or the kings, the things. There's all kinds of drag. It's not just cis men who are dressing up as women. Drag is a huge spectrum. And so tip the gals and uh, yeah, at the very least, like go watch the show We're Here on HBO. Um,
Mm.
watch one episode of that. That's easy to do. You don't have to leave your house, and you probably have HBO Max or whatever it is, Max now.
Yeah,
Um,
whatever. Well, I've said before, my only complaint about drag as a Christian is there's not enough under oath being sang. So that's my only complaint. It
okay, well,
sounds like my complaint. I'm gonna have to file that to somebody else because you clearly are not gonna be the person taking that complaint
you,
and making something happen.
I send me your favorite song, and I will see if there's a drag performance I can do with it. Okay, and if not, I'm sure there's a drag king who can probably like turn that out. So
Well, here's the thing: is you and I are going to be at the same event here in a couple
that's
months. And,
right.
I certainly will be singing Reliant K during karaoke. Maybe
Fabulous.
there's a Reliant K kinda drag thing that
Yeah,
we could do. I don't know if I'll dress in drag, but we could at least perform together.
come on, let's do it. I love
That'd be
it.
fun.
Yeah, that'd be
I
really
love it.
fun.
Alright, Flamey, how do you hope your drag inspires and liberates people who watch it, engage with it? But yeah, how do you hope it inspires and liberates them?
Yeah, I think I just have to go back to the very first thing I said, which is that I hope it helps you disconnect from shame.
Mm,
I hope it teaches you and gives you a an out from any shame that you're still holding on to for whatever reason about who you are or how you want to your posture in the world, how you carry yourself. The things that people have like shamed you for are probably your actual superpower, and I hope that drag can be a way for you to see that shame does not have a place. It's not for us.
love it. Love it. Last question, how can listeners get connected to you and your work?
I'm at Flamy Grant on all the social medias. My music's on every streaming platform you could possibly want to listen. And flamygrant.com is my website. Like I said, I'm moving to North Carolina this week. And so I'm going to be doing
Which
a
is a
whole bunch.
great place to go and do drag, right?
I mean, I'm not going to lie. We
Coming
have
from
some,
California, I mean,
yep,
what a move. What a
we have
great career
we
move.
have some nerves about it, but at the same time, it is kind of like the front lines. You know, Tennessee is the probably the front lines of this stupid culture war that we unfortunately have to engage in. But yeah, we're going so that I can be there and have a presence like where it'll hopefully make a little bit more of a difference. San Diego's going to be fine without me, but I think we can have an impact in
But
the
North Carolina
southeast.
needs you.
Yeah, I hope so. So
Love
yeah,
that.
so I'm touring all over East Coast, Northeast, Midwest. So just check out my shows and come see me.
Can't wait. Well, thank you so much for chatting a little bit more about you and your drag. It's just been so cool to see this story unfold, and so thank you so much for sharing a little bit more about it, how it has shaped your faith and your theology, and I'm excited to see you soon.
Thank you for having me. I can't wait.